Hey everybody, this review started out life as the Holiday 2023 review, but it ended up taking a lot longer to finish up than I thought it would, so now it's pulling double duty as the Holiday 2023 review and the New Year's 2024 review. So, happy holidays and happy new year. To mark the occasion, I decided to take a look at Rimworld, along with all three of its expansion packs, Royalty, Ideology, and Biotech, all of which are available on PC, Mac, and Linux, and it does have native Steam Deck support as well. And as I'm recording this video, the base game, Royalty, and Ideology are all available on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 as well, with the ability to play them on backwards compatibility with PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S, but the Biotech DLC is not yet available for the console version. And while all of the gameplay footage you'll be seeing throughout this video is of the PC version, I did also put quite a bit of time into this on the Steam Deck, and I will talk about that experience more towards the end of the video. This is a colony sim by Ludion Studios that was released in full in October of 2018, although it had an early access period leading up to that, which ultimately got started with the Kickstarter being funded all the way back in 2013. It was extremely well received and has seen continued development ever since, with 3 additional DLCs to expand the amount of content, those being Royalty, which released in 2020, Ideology, which released in 2021, and Biotech, which released in 2022. And there have also been numerous tweaks and improvements to the base game along with these expansions. Although keep in mind that's all for the PC, Mac, and Linux versions. The console versions got their first release in 2022, and they've been slowly catching up with the expansions ever since. I should mention before I go any further that I have absolutely no experience with the console versions either. I only have experience with the PC and technically Linux version in the form of the Steam Deck. And while you would think that the controls would be fairly similar between the Steam Deck and the console version, they actually are not. From a controls perspective, it's closer to what I see from the likes of Halo Wars, where you have a cursor in the middle of the screen, and whenever you try to move to select anything, it moves your whole view around. And while I unfortunately don't have any gameplay footage to show you of the Steam Deck version, because I don't have recordings set up with my Steam Deck yet, I will talk more about how it plays on the Steam Deck later on. Now then, all that said, what exactly are we dealing with here? What is Rimworld like to play, and how is it as a colony sim? And what even is a colony sim? Because there are probably a fair few people out there watching this video who don't even know what a colony sim is. Well, before I really answer that question, let's go ahead and talk about the presentation first. Now obviously, even at a casual glance, you can tell there's not a huge amount going on in terms of visuals or sound design here. The entire game takes place from a top-down perspective and is rendered entirely with 2D graphics. Despite everything being 2D, however, there are a fair number of details in the game that give some illusions of depth, as well as some more subtle touches to the visuals that help it come a bit more alive. Things like the way shadows are cast based on what time of day it is, or the way snow will gradually accumulate or gradually melt, thus changing the terrain, or things like the grass and other plants fluttering and swaying with the wind. Beyond those kinds of details, however, there's not a whole lot going on in terms of visuals. Like I said, everything is top-down perspective, with 2D graphics that are detailed enough to where you can tell what something is even at just a quick glance, but not so detailed that you're going to be able to just stop and admire it and be impressed by it. In particular, any of what the game refers to as pawns, which are either the humanoid characters that make up your colony or make up invaders to your colony or whatever it may well be, or mechanoids, which are robots, or the various animals and insects that you might encounter, are all just static 2D graphics that glide along the ground, and while the appearance will change slightly depending on what that particular pawn is wearing in terms of equipment, as well as things like whether or not they have tattoos, what the color of their skin is, what the color of their hair is, and what hairstyle they have, and whatever they happen to be carrying, they're all undetailed 2D graphics that have no animations, and so it's really up to your imagination to fill in the gaps of what exactly is going on whenever they're just moving around or interacting with a plant or a building or whatever the case may be. And while there will certainly be a lot of blood splattered all over the place whenever combat breaks out, There's no detailed gore or anything like that. The only thing you'll really notice is if a pawn loses their head, then the image of that pawn will change to reflect the fact that they just don't have a head anymore by making the head disappear. So if you want to tell what kind of damage a pawn is actually sustaining, then you need to go into their health menu and just take a look at the listings of what kind of damage they've sustained. This of course brings me over to the interface, because as easily readable as the graphics themselves are, that's only part of the equation when it comes to colony sims, or more broadly, strategy and management games. You also need to take a look at the user interface, and thankfully, the user interface in Rimworld is rather clean and easy to work with. All of your colony's residents are shown at the top of the screen, and if you want to select one of them to have them focus on a task, or you just need to get an idea of what's going on with them, you can just click on them at the very top of the screen and it will instantly select them, and then you can double click it to go immediately to where they are on the map. Whenever you have a pawn selected, an interface will show up in the bottom left of the screen that gives you more information about that pawn and has several sub-menus that you can go through to get more details on them. And while you have a pawn selected, you'll have a selection of options next to that interface that gives you various actions that you can perform, such as being able to draft them and then use them as a military unit briefly, or select their weapon to be able to issue an attack order to either an object in the environment or, of course, another pawn, whether it be an animal or a robot or another humanoid being or whatever it may well be. And depending on whether that pawn has a specific role in your colony or whether they have special abilities or whatever they happen to have equipped, you'll have a selection of different options there to reflect that. For example, if you select a Psycaster, then they'll have their special Psycasting abilities listed alongside things like being able to just attack things or draft them or whatever. And in the event you want to improve your efficiency a bit and use hotkeys instead of just clicking on things in the interface, the hotkeys for those various actions are all listed right on the buttons themselves, so it's all pretty intuitive and easy to work with. Same kind of thing goes for whenever you want to build something. You just click on the Architect button down at the bottom of your screen, and that brings up the interface of what you can build listed by category, and it's only going to show stuff that you happen to have access to at any given moment based on what research you have currently unlocked. Thus, as you continue to complete your research, then the options will expand there and it will start to fill out the screen a bit more. And speaking of that Architect button, the bottom of the screen in general is where you will find all of the more broadly focused options for your colony. Things like being able to assign different pawns to complete different tasks. So if you have somebody who's really good at cooking and somebody else who's really bad at cooking, you can go into that interface and change it so the person who's bad at cooking won't try to do any cooking jobs, and the person who's good at it will be able to work on those cooking jobs. There's also things like the scheduling interface where you set what hours the various colonists are going to be working versus sleeping versus engaging in recreation or whatever, as well as an interface for assigning things like what medicine that a pawn is allowed to use or what outfits they're allowed to wear and so on and so forth, as well as the research interface where you can select which research project you want to work on, as well as an interface for animals that are part of your colony versus a separate interface for the local wildlife that are on the map but aren't actually part of your colony, and so on and so forth. The only one of these that will take you to a radically different interface is the world option, which will show you the world map, not just your colony, and then you can select different spots on the world map to send caravans to, so they can either just go to different facilities to investigate them and raid them, or you can send them on trading missions or what have you. And all of these interfaces are straightforward and very easy to work with. Really, the only part of the interface that's actually a bit clunky to work with sometimes is the bottom right of your screen, and it's specifically with all the very small icons you see down there. Those all enable various overlays or additional tooltips and such like that, and that's really just a matter of figuring out exactly which ones you want to have active at any given point, and then just selecting them to turn them on when you need them, to turn them off when you don't need them, and it's pretty straightforward once you've figured it out, but there is an adjustment period there where there's really not that much of an adjustment period with any other part of the interface. So when you look at all of the graphics together, whether it be the actual graphics themselves or the interface, they've done a great job with all of it. It's easy to read, it's intuitive, and it's very easy to get used to for the most part. There are a few hiccups here and there, but they don't take that long to get used to. And while the graphics themselves are certainly not going to impress you from a technical or really even much of an artistic standpoint, they're all very functional, and that's perfectly fine for a strategy and management simulation type game such as Rimworld. Where the presentation definitely turns into more of a mixed bag, however, is the sound design, where there's no voice acting in the game at all, so there's nothing to speak of there, but the sound effects themselves are functional, but definitely very unimpressive, particularly with things like gun and explosion sounds. They'll definitely get the job done, but they just don't have a whole lot of punch behind them. It's not really something I expect out of a strategy management type game like this, but it is worth noting that the sounds of combat just don't really have a whole lot going on there. And as for the rest of the sound effects, whether it be interface sounds or the sounds of building things or interacting with various structures like the sounds of tailoring clothing or cutting stone blocks or whatever the case may be, it's all functional. It sounds more or less like what that particular action is, but it's nothing impressive. Now, the only thing that really stands out about the sound design is the soundtrack by Alistair Lindsay, which is a bit odd to describe because you can't really pin it into one specific genre of music, but a sizable chunk of it is clearly Western-inspired and is meant to harken back to one of the game's most heavy influences, which is the TV series Firefly. And in case you're not familiar with Firefly, arguably the best way to describe its genre is space western. So you get an interesting sci-fi mixed with western vibe, and while I have a hard time describing the soundtrack itself, it works great for the game. And if anything, the soundtrack actually compensates for the rest of the sound design being so lackluster, so great job on that, Alistair, but other than that, there's not really anything worth talking about as far as the sound design goes. It's very functional and not really anything more than that. The thing is, the presentation isn't what really matters here. What really matter are the story and the gameplay. Except the game doesn't actually have a storyline. Instead, it's a story generator. What exactly does that mean? Well, it means that when you start the game up, you select a new colony, and then you're given a selection of options for what you want your colony set up to be. The so-called default mode is called Crash Landed, where you have a selection of 3 colonists who are the survivors of some calamity that befell their ship in space, and thus they had to abandon ship and crash land on the Rimworld that you now have to build up your colony on. The other main option you get right off the bat is the Lost Tribe, where you have a selection of 5 colonists whose original village was overrun and they had to escape into the wilderness, and thus you are building up the colony from wherever they ended up running off to. And while these are the 2 main ones that are included with the game by default, all of these are highly customizable. You can go in and alter pretty much whatever you want as the starting conditions, whether it be the number of colonists you start with, what kind of equipment they start with, whether they start with certain research unlocked or not, whether they have animals along with them, what kind of faction relations they have with other factions already on the map. However you want that initial setup to go, you can do it, but that's only for the initial setup phase. Once you're past that, then you have to generate a world, and you can select a different size of world if you want it. Default is 30% of the world being generated, but you can go up to 50% or even 100%, which will generate an entire planet full of land masses and existing settlements and such for you to explore and mess around with. Although obviously it's considerably more system intensive, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you're just kind of going all in on something crazy. And during this process, you're given the option of changing the random seed that it's going to use to generate the world, as well as which parameters you want to set, which is to say how many AI-controlled settlements are going to be on the world, how much rainfall you're going to experience, what kind of temperatures you're going to experience, and which factions you're going to run into. It starts with all of them selected that are available, but you can also go in and add extra ones of different types if you like. From there, it's a matter of getting your initial colonists generated, and they are all randomly generated. You can change their names, but otherwise it's a matter of randomly generated stats and backstories and whether they have existing injuries or not, and you can end up with some real characters through that. And this also includes different relationships, which can result in a variety of interesting situations where you might have multiple members of a given family in your colony, or they might be spread out in the world, or you might have a couple of colonists who were ex-lovers and so they just don't get along at all. It can get fairly complicated at times. Once you've got your world generated, your initial conditions set, your location for your colony picked out, and what size of colony you have if you go into the advanced options there, and you've got all of your colonists generated, it's off into the world itself, and from there you will be thrown onto the map, and your colonists will either be standing in the middle of the area, or they will land in their drop pods, and from then on out, the story is yours to create. And based on the AI storyteller you picked during the initial setup phase, you can end up with a variety of outcomes. If you pick Phoebe Chillax as your AI storyteller, then you'll have long periods of not very many things happening, but when something does happen, it can get a bit hectic. If you pick Cassandra Classic, it's a very gradual buildup of challenge over time, more or less what you would expect from a fairly typical strategy game type thing. And then there's Randy Random. We love Randy Random. Randy Random is the best AI storyteller, at least once you've gotten used to how the game works anyway, because the only thing you can really predict about Randy Random's AI storytelling is that you can't really predict what's going to happen. You might get a whole bunch of supply drops. You might get a whole bunch of storms. You might get a whole bunch of raiders showing up. You might have a whole bunch of insect infestations. You might be minding your own business, building up your colony, and then Randy decides all of a sudden to give you a heat wave, as well as 2 or 3 trading caravans, and suddenly 2 or 3 pirate raids, all in the span of a single day in-game. This is because Randy Random does not care about fairness. He doesn't care whether it's a challenging experience or not. All he cares about is that the story of your colony is interesting. And that's what this game is really all about. It's not just about building up your colony, making sure that all of your colonists' needs are met, that they're able to survive and even thrive in this Rimworld. Now, to quote the game's Steam page, Rimworld is designed to co-author tragic, twisted, and triumphant stories about imprisoned pirates, desperate colonists, starvation, and survival. And that is exactly what Rimworld does. To give you a prime example of what I'm talking about, in one of the runs I recorded for this particular video, I set up a sanguiphage colony. Now, sanguiphages are part of the Biotech expansion, but just bear with me a moment here. The basic idea you have to understand is that sanguiphages are effectively vampires. They are ageless, extremely tough, and have several special abilities that utilize a resource they have called hemogen. They replenish hemogen by feeding upon the blood of humanoids. Needless to say, they're the kind of thing that most people are absolutely terrified of, and for very good reason. Now, this start gives you 2 colonists, the sanguiphage themselves, and a regular human to effectively serve as their blood bag. Going a bit further with this, I set up an ideology for this particular colony that has them revering blood feeders, and thus being effectively a blood bag for a sanguiphage would actually be a great honor. To make matters weirder in this case, the colonists that were randomly generated were the sanguiphage, who was extremely tough and a very powerful fighter, as well as a gifted socialite, but didn't really have any other skills of note. The human that was generated, on the other hand, was really good at pretty much everything else. Building things, growing plants, cooking food, all the stuff that was really necessary to get the colony really going. And during the random generation process, it ended up so that the regular human was the daughter of the sanguiphage. Now, how did they exactly end up crashing on this Rimworld? Well, there's a blurb at the start of the game that gives you a brief primer, but you can change the blurb that starts at the beginning of the game during the scenario editing phase, so it can really be just whatever you want, and honestly, I kind of ignore the blurb at the beginning anyway, so I more or less made up the headcanon that the mother and her daughter were escaping persecution and ended up crash landing on this Rimworld after things went awry, but they were going to make the best of a bad situation and make themselves a home. And so they set about doing this. They get a farm set up, they get a warehouse for the meager supplies they brought with them, as well as whatever they can scrounge up here, and they start getting the lodging set up. During this whole process, the sanguiphage, Razi, is having a really hard time because sanguiphages are sensitive to sunlight, and the environmental conditions are kind of chilly, and they don't have any furniture to really do anything on, so eating without a table, which is a war crime in this game in case you didn't know, was putting her in a really terrible mood. She was sleeping on the ground, outside, in the rain, in the cold, and generally just being kind of miserable. And it was into this perfect storm of a situation where the psychic drone kicked in from Randy Random's events. A psychic drone sours the mood of your colonists. So Razi the Sanguiphage, already in a terrible mood, was just getting into more and more of an awful mood until eventually she snapped and went berserk. And when a pawn goes berserk in Rimworld, they start attacking whoever's nearby. In Razi's case, it was her daughter Amy. Now, if Razi had just been attacking her with her bare hands, that would have been bad enough because vampire strength. But she also had a longsword. So she proceeded to, in a berserk rage, slice her own daughter's left hand and right arm off, resulting in her daughter being completely incapacitated, on the ground in agony, bleeding everywhere. And that wasn't quite enough to get rid of the berserk rage, so Razi continued off into the wilderness and started just hacking her way through the local wildlife until eventually the berserk rage subsided, and by the time she got back, her daughter, who I might remind you was the only reason the colony was basically standing, was now dead. Oh sure, Razi the Sanguiphage tried to pick up the pieces, she tried to continue on the colony without her daughter, but it wasn't going well because Razi didn't have any skills other than just beating the living crap out of things. She was terrible at building things, so it took forever to get any kind of lodgings put up. She was terrible at growing plants, so she didn't have a reliable food source. And as it turns out, even if she did have a reliable food source, it probably wouldn't have mattered much because she was absolutely terrible at cooking. And as such, when she did finally get some food made out of the animals that she had slaughtered in her berserk rage, it gave her food poisoning, to the point where she ended up passed out on the floor in agony. And while she was writhing on the ground in agony, unable to do anything because of this food poisoning, some mad raccoons showed up. Now, ordinarily, that would be absolutely no big deal for a mighty sanguiphage at all, except that she was suffering from severe food poisoning, and thus was basically incapacitated by pain. When she was finally able to get back up because the pain had subsided enough, the raccoons would come in and bite her and scratch at her and such, increasing the pain to the point where she would collapse again. But because they weren't able to do enough damage to her to actually finish her off, she was just stuck in this horrible limbo of getting back up only to be knocked back down by mad raccoons. And thus ends the tragedy of Razi the Sanguiphage, eternally punished for her act of kinslaying at the teeth and paws of small, insane mammals. It's the kind of thing that puts Rimworld squarely in the realm of games like Dwarf Fortress. The most insane, ridiculous things can happen, generating some of the most interesting gaming stories you're likely to ever experience. It more than makes up for the lack of any real defined narrative, although it does have some vague sense of narrative, in the sense that there are actually a couple of ways you can get a game over scenario. The first of them is like what I mentioned just now, where all of your colonists can be either dead or abducted, and thus the colony has failed. Or you reach one of the game's victory conditions. Now, if you only have the base game, there's only one victory condition, which is either you build your own starship and take to the stars, or you receive and accept an offer to journey to the stars on someone else's ship that is located somewhere on the planet, and you have to basically upend your colony and move all of your guys over there. Either way, the result is the same. You get on a starship, and then you take off into the stars. But while you're given this option for an endgame, you actually don't need to do it. You can just keep playing as long as you want and as long as you're able to keep the colony going. So what exactly does that entail? Well, In order to keep your colony going and continue to experience those interesting stories I just mentioned, you need to make sure that your colonists' needs are met and that they're able to fend off any kind of threat, whether it be some kind of invasion or just the environment or whatever the case may be. So you need to make sure that your colonists have food, a safe place to sleep, preferably with a bed rather than just a spot on the floor, as well as clothing appropriate to the environment they're in. If it's a hot environment, then lighter clothing that insulates better against heat versus in a colder environment, more thick clothing that insulates well against cold. And they'll also need some form of recreation as well as medicine in the event that they get sick or injured. And while all those things sound rather straightforward, actually fulfilling those needs can get fairly tricky depending on which environment you're in and what the skills of your colonists are. The more skilled a colonist is in a particular field, then the better the results are going to be for whatever they're doing. For example, someone with a higher plant skill will be able to harvest more of a particular plant in your farm as opposed to someone who has a lower skill. And if their skill is low enough, then they can even botch the harvest entirely and you don't get anything. Meanwhile, if someone with a low animal skill tries to train the various animals you have in your ranch, then they're not really going to have very good results, if they can even train it at all. Certain animals require higher values of skill just to be able to train them in the first place, or just outright tame them if they're a wild animal, for example. Someone with a higher construction skill will be able to build furniture and buildings much more quickly and more efficiently than someone who has a lower skill value, and like with the plant situation, if their construction skill is low enough, then they can botch construction and waste resources. This is all to say that you need to make sure that the right colonists are all working on the specific jobs that they're really best at. This means that the direction your colony goes will likely depend on what your starting skill set is. If you have people who aren't very good at harvesting plants, but they're good with animals, then you'll probably steer your colonists more in the direction of ranching, so that they're raising domesticated animals so that they can have a reliable source of meat. In the case of animals that grow wool, they'll have a reliable source of fabric that they can use to craft their clothing and such. And then depending on the type of animals they're ranching, then they might have reliable sources of milk or eggs, or in the case of the various boom animals, chem fuel. And of course, on the other side of things, if your colonists aren't good with animals, but they're good with plants, you're probably going to set up a bunch of farms and end up having a mostly vegetarian diet with your colonists. And then if you don't have colonists good with either plants or animals, well, you have the option of hunting the local wildlife, but what happens once you run out of that? Well, you might have to get a bit creative, and those creative solutions might lead you down some fairly dark paths. So even something as seemingly straightforward as feeding your colonists can actually get pretty complicated, and you find that that's the case with pretty much everything that's in this game. For example, if one of your colonists suffers an injury, then it might be something like, oh, well, they have a bruise on their right upper arm. Or they might have lost a single finger on one of their hands, and that is specifically tracked, and it affects the way they can manipulate things. Or they might have suffered damage to a specific internal organ, and that organ might need to be either removed or replaced. And whether it's a limb or an internal organ, then you can replace those with either prosthetics, or once you get later on in the game and have access to more advanced technology, you can replace them with bionics that work just as well, or maybe even slightly better than natural body parts and organs. And speaking of research, that's going to play a vital role in what you're able to do with your colony. If you play the Lost Tribe start, for example, then you're not going to be able to make a whole lot of things until you've gotten some of your research. For example, you can't even cut stone blocks until you've researched the appropriate technology for it. Or you can't make metal armor or weapons until you've researched smithing. And of course, when it comes to things like being able to have some climate control, you're going to have to rely on things like campfires and passive cooling that is fueled by wood, as opposed to being able to set up electric heaters and coolers and have the appropriate infrastructure to support them. And when it comes to defending yourself, you're going to have some very limited options there until you've gotten some research in or managed to scavenge stuff from whoever happens to invade you, or if you happen to go on raids yourself. Whereas if you're not doing the Neolithic tribal start, and you start with the standard crash landed, for example, then you're going to start with a couple of gunpowder weapons, and you'll be able to make some fairly simple but effective melee weapons and ranged weapons, so bows and swords and spears and things like that. But of course, eventually you'll be able to research the ability to make your own firearms, and eventually even charged munitions, which are outright sci-fi technology, and along the way you might unlock things like being able to produce better medicine, or being able to use hydroponics as opposed to relying entirely on the environmental conditions for farming. And you'll go from very simple and straightforward security measures like very basic traps and sandbags and barricades, on up through things like mortars, which allow your colonists to shell enemies from afar, or automated gun turrets, which can eventually become automated cannon turrets. Your colonists will gradually go from wielding effectively sticks and stones up to wielding firearms and eventually spacer tech munitions, and of course going from only wearing clothing to wearing actual armor of some kind, whether it be a medieval style of plate armor or a flak armor that is more in keeping with what we use these days, or sci-fi style power armor, and of course your colonists' skills will gradually improve as they go about doing their various jobs. So you'll find that starting out the game you might end up in a very difficult situation, but over time the more basic elements of it, being able to produce your own food and resources and build structures and that sort of thing, will become easier over time. What won't become easier is all of the crazy things that will happen to your colony over the course of the game, through all of the random events that will occur, the diseases that will pop up that might be utterly debilitating even if you have the appropriate medicine to deal with them, and of course the ever-expanding number and complexity of the raiders that will be attacking your colony over time. The better off your colony is doing, the more difficult events the AI storyteller will start throwing at you, and by that I mean it basically goes almost entirely off of the wealth value of your colony, which of course will continue to get higher and higher the more resources you have, the more colonists you have, the better those colonists are, and the better equipment and research you have. And while there are certainly things you can do to exploit the various pawns' AI and thus laid them into kill boxes and such like that, eventually you will hit the point where what the game is throwing at you is completely overwhelming, either just from the sheer number and power of the enemies it's throwing at you, or the fact that it is just throwing so many enemies at you that it slows the game down to a crawl in terms of performance. And really, I think performance is the main limiting factor here, because over time, as there is just so much that this game needs to calculate, eventually you will start noticing the performance degrading. And the beefier your computer, the longer you can go before that really starts to become a problem. And this of course does lead me into the problems with Rimworld. It's not just the fact that performance will gradually degrade over time, because that's a relatively common thing with strategy games of many types. That's just a matter of workload. The more stuff needs to be calculated in a given game, the longer it's going to take to do that, and thus the performance is just going to gradually degrade over time. But no, that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about problems that are endemic to Rimworld, things that it does specifically that do drag the experience down. The first of these is the combat. You have very limited controls for the combat system in this. You can order your pawns around so you can have them take cover behind objects or have them target specific enemies, and if they have special abilities, then you can make use of those special abilities during combat. But you can't really set up any advanced maneuvers or anything like that. It's all very simple and straightforward, and you unfortunately end up having to rely on RNG with regards to where incoming projectiles and melee attacks are going to hit either your colony or the enemies that they're attacking. And while this is certainly functional, it often results in situations that you didn't really intend to happen. For example, you might find an enemy that has really good stats and you want to capture them and convert them over to your faction, but because of the RNG involved with the incoming attacks and such, your colonists actually end up just instantly killing them by either knocking their head off or destroying their brain or something along those lines. The thing is, the same kind of thing can happen with your colonists. You can just end up in a situation where you go into battle, you've got them equipped as best you can, and they're going up against enemies that they should be able to easily handle, and then all of a sudden an enemy gets a lucky shot in and insta-kills one of your colonists. And because this is a colony sim and not just a normal real-time strategy game, you can't just easily replace your colonists, so that can be quite frustrating. But of course, part of being able to enjoy colony sims is that you have to let go of some amount of control. You have to understand that sometimes things just happen, and that can make for more interesting stories. And weirdly enough, the problem with having more direct control over the combat in this compared to something like Dwarf Fortress, where you have almost no control over the combat other than just setting up the equipment that your squads have and then giving them general orders to attack a specific enemy or station themselves in a specific area, is that you're going to be a lot more tempted to think of this as a more standard strategy or tactics game. And that can put you into some really bad habits when it comes to just embracing the colony sim idea. Because remember, even though the mechanics themselves are deep, it's not about mechanics. It's about the stories that you come up with by leading your colony to riches or ruin. And that's just a trickier thing to manage in a game that's on a much more micro scale like Rimworld is. You have direct control over individual colonists, and while you only have limited control over them, it's still relatively easy to get into the habit of thinking of them as units to control, and that's just going to lead you into the cycle of frustration of going, okay, why the hell didn't you hit that target? Or, okay, what the hell's going on with you? Why aren't you following my orders? And so on and so forth. So that more direct control over your pawns than the likes of, say, Dwarf Fortress or other colony sims that are on a larger scale than this is definitely a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's actually pretty much necessary considering how small the colony can be. You can have colonies as small as a single colonist on up to dozens of colonists, so you need to have that finer grain control to be able to have the game even really function. But on the other hand, it's pretty easy for the combat system to put you into the wrong mindset, and then you start thinking about the game in the wrong terms. You start thinking of the combat as woefully deficient compared to games that are dedicated strategy and or tactics games that do give you that finer control with much more options for control than something like Rimworld, which isn't really trying to be a tactics game in the first place. So while this is certainly not a deal breaker, it is something you should keep in mind if you're considering playing Rimworld. Don't get locked into that mentality by accident, because it is very easy to do it at first. Certainly feel free to make use of whatever tactical acumen you have, but don't just start getting frustrated with the game because the pawns aren't doing the exact things you want them to do, because they're not intended to be just mindless units that you would control like you would in any other standard strategy game like Age of Empires or whatever. Anyway, moving on to some of the other problems the game has, there are a surprising number of features that you would expect to be in the game but just aren't. For example, this being intended to be more of a survival situation in terms of the general scenario you're playing through, you would think that in addition to manufacturing their own weapons and clothing and armor and things like that, your colonists would also have to manufacture ammunition for their weapons. But that's not the case. The only weapon in the entire game that requires any kind of ammunition to be manufactured is the mortar, and in that case you're manufacturing mortar shells. But when it comes to personal weapons, like the various firearms or bows and arrows or things like that, well, your colonists can equip them and just use them, and never have to worry about ammunition at all. In a similar vein, you would think that you would need to make sure your colonists have access to some sort of beverages, whether it be just plain old water, or milk, or juices, or whatever the case may be, but you don't need to worry about that either. You only need to give them food. Now, obviously, neither of these things are particularly major issues. They're just odd omissions that you would think would be in the game, but for some odd reason aren't. But then there are things that do start to get in your way, like the lack of any kind of storage structures, whether it be shelves or boxes or anything like that, to help compact the items that you have in your stockpiles. Because you'll find one of the bigger issues the game has, even fairly early on, but let alone the further you get in the game and the more resources you collect, is that storage space becomes a serious problem. You just end up with a lot of space needed to store all of the random crap that your colony has collected, and there's just no efficient way to do that. And speaking of efficiency, there are some odd issues here and there with the pawn pathfinding so that they don't take optimal routes. They don't necessarily use pathways you've created as well as you might hope they would. And trying to get your electrical grid set up can be a real pain as well, at least if you're one of those people who likes to have a nice, clean colony to go on. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with conduits all over the place, and it's just going to look awful. And even beyond things like that, there are some odd gaps in content and features here and there as well. So, for example, there are no fluid dynamics of any kind. You can't have liquids flow from one area to another. If there's a river on the map, or if there's a lake on the map, or something like that, then it's always going to be in one position and you can't do anything with it. You can't channel out new areas for water, for example. And even the water itself, you can't really do a whole lot with. I mean, in a river that actually has a flow, you can set up watermill generators, but that's all you can do with it. You can't, for example, have your colonists go fishing at the river or lake or whatever so that you have an extra source of food or something like that. And there are also no Z-levels in this game, meaning there is no simulation of height whatsoever. Everything takes place on the same 2D plane, which means that if you were wanting to build towers or apartment complexes or something like that, you just can't, and you can't delve down into a cavern layer or anything like that either. And as for odd gaps in content here and there, once you get into the industrial era tech and beyond, everything feels pretty fleshed out, but everything before that, so the Neolithic tech, the stuff that you start with when you're doing the tribal start, and the roughly medieval technology, is so highly compressed that it feels like it was a complete afterthought. Like they didn't even want to put it in the game, but they just did, so you had that experience in there, and just get through it as quickly as possible so you can get to the air quotes good stuff. But then at the same time, you have the tech level distinction, so if you start as the tribal start, and thus you have the Neolithic tech level, you're stuck with that Neolithic tech level throughout the entire rest of your research, and that means that everything takes longer to research just because you started at that level. Whereas if you do the crash landed start, and thus you start at the industrial level of tech, the Neolithic and medieval techs you don't currently have are actually easier to research, and the spacer tech stuff that you don't have access to yet takes less time to research than if you were at a Neolithic tech level. And while you would think as you go up through the research that you would gradually improve your tech level and thus the research would get easier, it doesn't work that way. You start at the Neolithic tech level, you suffer that same penalty to research throughout the entire rest of the game. And then of course there's one feature that was really baffling by its absence, which is the fact that colonists could not reproduce in the base game, and still can't in the base game actually. They can only reproduce if you have the Biotech DLC, because that's one of the features that it adds. Why was it baffling by its absence? Well, even in the base game you can have characters that are related to one another, whether it be siblings or aunts or uncles or parents or whatever it may well be, but none of your colonists could make offspring of their own until the Biotech DLC came out. It was just weird. And ultimately, I think that was the biggest problem with the base game of Rimworld when it originally released, and even so many updates later. It's that despite the game having quite a bit of content and a ton of depth and being a fully complete experience, it still feels like it's not finished. And while it doesn't necessarily feel like it's unfinished in a bad way, I mean, it is effectively feature complete for the base game that they were wanting to deliver, it just leaves you with the impression that Rimworld could be so much more than what it is. And that's where the DLCs come in, because they start adding in a bunch of new features and content that flesh out the experience even more, and in the case of Biotech in particular, might even add in features that seem really odd by their omission in the base game. So what exactly are we dealing with there? Well, the first DLC we got was the Royalty DLC, which adds in the Empire faction, along with a nobility system associated with them, where your pawns can actually become nobility within the Empire and gradually rise through the ranks, which grants them additional imperial privileges, but also increases the demands those particular pawns have. And in addition to the Empire faction and the nobility system associated with it, there's also the psi-casting system, which is associated with the Empire, where part of the process of becoming an imperial noble is that you have the ability to cast psionic abilities bestowed on the pawn that becomes a noble, and over time, their abilities can gradually expand. Although you don't necessarily have to become an imperial noble to become a psi-caster as well. That's a whole other thing there, and that's associated with quests that come up in the royalty DLC, which it does add quite a lot of, by the way. So you have a whole bunch of new random events and new random quest lines that come in and allow you to interact with the various factions in other ways. Then, of course, there is the new victory condition of Royal Ascent, whereby rising through the ranks of the Empire, eventually you can get shuttle passage off-world, and it's effectively like the Ship to the Stars ending, but instead of having to build your own ship, or find this other ship and then get it ready to launch, you rise through the ranks of the Empire, and eventually, after proving yourself to them, they will grant you the ability to take a shuttle off-world and win the game effectively. All of these features and all of the expanded content are very nice to have in the game, and it expands both your later game playthrough with the extra content that the Empire faction provides, as well as some of the earlier game stuff in terms of being able to become sidecasters as tribals, who get the very attractive option of linking with an anima tree that will grant them sidecasting abilities as well, and that will be how they can improve their sidecasting abilities as well, by just expanding their connection with the anima tree. But while all these things are nice to have, expand the experience of Rimworld, and generally just make it a better experience overall, because they all integrate with the base game once you've got the expansion installed, none of the changes brought about by the royalty DLC address some of the problems that the base game has. It really is just a content expansion, which, as long as you keep that in mind, is perfectly fine. It is worth noting, however, that while this expansion is definitely very worthwhile for people who have already been playing Rimworld for a while and are definitely enjoying it, for a new player it introduces some additional challenge that may be a bit tricky for them to deal with at first. After all, if you decide to have some of your colonists get those nobility ranks, that can pretty dramatically increase the value of your settlement, which will very quickly start to increase the challenge of things that are thrown at you. And if you don't know that's going to be a thing, then it can be fairly difficult to prepare for, so it is worth keeping in mind that while the content added in the royalty DLC is great to have and is great to expand your game with, it's not necessarily something I would say a brand new player should immediately start interacting with. It's the kind of stuff that a new player should only start interacting with once they're comfortable with the general gameplay experience of Rimworld. This is not necessarily something I would say about the Ideology DLC, however, which was the second DLC made available for Rimworld and is, from what I can tell, the most controversial of the lot, because the changes it makes to the game are very significant. You see, it dramatically overhauls the experience of playing Rimworld by introducing a belief system, which means that every single pawn now has a set of beliefs that they must adhere to, and whenever you start up a new colony with the Ideology DLC installed, you have to select what you want to do with the Ideology system in your new colony run. It's going to either be a fluid belief system where you'll set a few parameters for the ideology to start out with, and then over time you can make additional changes to that ideology, introducing new ideas to it, new restrictions, that sort of thing, as your colony expands and you decide that things need to be different. The other options you have for the ideology system are to create a fixed one where all of the memes and precepts are selected right at the colony generation phase and they cannot change throughout the rest of your colony's existence, or you can select one of the pre-generated ideologies that it creates for that particular colony run. So what exactly do these belief systems entail? Well, they can be things that are fairly simple and straightforward, very basic ideologies with very simple rituals that don't really affect the gameplay experience all that much, but put some slight flavor on your colony, all the way up to basically fanatical religions that dramatically alter the way your colony works, to the point where it can actually be fairly debilitating. I mean, after all, if you're setting up your colony in an environment where growing plants is really not feasible, and part of your ideology is that you can only eat plants, that can be really tricky to deal with. By the same token, if you pick a tribal start and thus you have the very low level of technology, but you make them transhumanists, so they demand age reversal procedures and demand artificial parts and things like that, that can also be tricky to deal with. And some of the belief systems require you to set up additional buildings to accommodate the various needs that your colonists are going to have when ascribing to this belief system, such as biosculpture pods and sleep accelerators for transhumanists. It is a feature that simultaneously makes the game far more interesting, but also can make it far more frustrating depending on the individual situation you find yourself in with whatever ideology you have set up. And then of course, regardless of which belief systems your colony is using, you also need to be careful of having multiple characters with different ideologies in the same colony, because that's not necessarily always going to be compatible. To that end, of course, you can try converting other colonists to your ideology, but that tends to be a very time-consuming and involved process that you really need to prepare yourself for. And even if you luck out and have a colony where multiple colonists have different belief systems that are actually compatible, that's going to start interfering with your ability to run the colony effectively, as they all are going to have different ritual times, they're going to have different building requirements for the temples and such, and so it's going to result in your colony just being a bit trickier to manage. Not unreasonably so, of course, but it will be a bit trickier. So this new belief system adds a ton of flavor to your Rimworld playthroughs, as well as a fair amount of challenge depending on your ideology, and it also brings a new selection of quests that involve hunting down the various relics associated with your ideology so you can display them in your temple, which in turn can bring even more prosperity to your colony. This all probably sounds great so far. You get some additional challenge, you get a whole lot of flavor to your playthrough, you get a bunch of new things you can do, so that all sounds great, but what's the catch? Well, it does increase the challenge of your Rimworld playthrough, especially if you end up with an ideology that you can't really support given what the circumstances of your colony are. And if you decide to play around with a belief system that is a bit more extreme and has a lot more stringent requirements to it, that can make things a lot more challenging, which is something you really don't want to be doing if you're a new player. Now, on the positive side with all of this, if for whatever reason you decide that the belief system is something you don't want to mess around with at all, there's an option when you're setting up the world for your colony to just disable the belief system entirely. This means that while you will get access to the new items as well as some of the new features that are added in the Ideology DLC, you won't need to worry about the belief system interfering with your ability to set up your colony the way you want to set it up. Although, personally, I've never run into a situation where the belief system actually interfere with my ability to run a colony, so I'm not entirely sure why you would want to just disable the belief system entirely, unless you just want a very vanilla Rimworld experience. Maybe you're just trying to learn to play the game in general, or there's just something very specific you want to do with a particular colony, and having the belief system active would interfere with your ability to accomplish that. Anyway, this does lead me to the other things that are added by the Ideology DLC. Now, the one feature it adds that is tied in with the belief system but isn't technically part of the belief system per se is aesthetic styles, where when you set up your belief system, you have aesthetic styles associated with it, such as morbid or totemic or rustic or something along those lines, which influences the way your various buildings and art installations and such like that are going to appear once you've built them. For example, if you have the morbid one set, then when you start building things that are affected by that aesthetic design, you'll notice that they'll have things like skull motifs on them. Whereas if you have one that is animalist, then the motifs are going to be animal themed, and so on and so forth. And if you build things of a particular aesthetic style that is associated with your colonist's belief system, then your colonists being in the presence of these things will very slightly increase their mood. It's not a major bonus, so it's not really anything that's truly gameplay affecting, but it does go back to giving your colony a bit more flavor. Same kind of thing goes for additional hairstyles, beards, tattoos, and the new clothing items, all of which are accessible regardless of whether you have the belief system set up or not, but can be part of the belief system. So you can have specific clothing items that must be worn by all members of a belief system, or must be worn by the colonists that take on specific social roles within that belief system, and as long as their ritualistic clothing requirements are not being met, then the colonists that aren't having those needs met will have a slight mood debuff. Beyond all that, there are also 2 additional features added to the ideology expansion, and those are a system for, shall we say, involuntary unpaid internships, along with a selection of options for how your belief system views the practice, so you can have your belief system find it absolutely abhorrent, or set up the belief system to actively require it, or just be completely indifferent toward the practice. And the other feature that is added to the Ideology DLC is the Garuu tree, where you might occasionally get a Garuu tree sprout somewhere on the map of your colony, and then you can harvest that and plant it in order to take advantage of the Garuu tree's symbiotic relationship with creatures called dryads. And a colonist can connect with a Garuu tree in order to gain control over the dryads that are attached to it, and these dryads can be specialized into a variety of things, like being able to just haul things around your colony, or periodically generating herbal medicine, or periodically generating another resource like berries or wood, or even helping defend your colony by attacking enemies or just taking hits for your colonists. And this feature fits in particularly well if you have more of an anima-oriented colony, so you have psycasters that are attached to the anima tree, and you tend to be more nature-focused and things like that. And in addition to all of that, there is also a new endgame feature called the Arco-Nexus, where over time, you will gradually gain access to a sequence of quests that will result in you continually rebuilding your colony at new locations until eventually you find the Arco-Nexus itself and utilize it to transcend physical reality. Needless to say, while that is very involved and a very long process, it's also a really friggin' cool way to finish your colony run. And when you bring all of that together, you end up with a very sizable chunk of content that expands and improves upon the base game experience in a way that the Royalty DLC really didn't. Whereas the Royalty DLC was just more content, the Ideology DLC is not only more content, but it also pretty significantly changes the way you play Rimworld, and generally for the better. But even with it improving and changing the gameplay experience of Rimworld by quite a bit, it still didn't quite address a few of those issues I mentioned with the base game. One of those issues did, however, get addressed with the Biotech DLC, the latest expansion for Rimworld, which introduces quite a few new features, and one of them I would consider is effectively mandatory. That being, your colonists can finally raise families of their own. And as your colonists' offspring grow, they will gradually have more and more life experiences that will lead them into developing different skills and developing passions for those skills, and they'll also develop personality traits over time based on their various experiences. Now, while it is great to have them finally adding that feature with the 3rd expansion, it shouldn't have taken this long to implement it, and frankly, it should have been in the base game to begin with. They did, however, go beyond simply throwing in a feature that should have been in the base game to begin with. They implemented an entire gene modding system, allowing you to create what the game refers to as xenohumans. These are humanoids that have genetic traits often radically different from your standard baseline human. These can range from things that are very similar to standard humans, like Neanderthals, to things that are much more exotic, like the Itakin, which are humanoids that have tails and thick fur and are adapted to the cold, or the Pigskins, which are, like the name might suggest, humanoids with pig-like features, or the Impids, which move really fast and can actually spit flames. And if the ones that are included in this expansion by default aren't enough for you, you can create your own xenohuman varieties. Now sure, it's more of a late game kind of thing because the technology required to do all of the gene modding is pretty high tech, so you need to have a pretty advanced colony to get all of that set up, but once you do, you've got the ability to create new xenotypes, you can implant new genes in your existing colonists, and you can also set up things like growth vats so you can just create and artificially grow new colonists instead of relying on the old-fashioned method. And along with all of this fancy gene modding stuff, they also introduced a specific type of xenohuman known as the sanguiphage. Now, I've already told you about the tragedy of Razi the Terrible Sanguiphage, But to expand a bit further on what a sanguiphage actually is, like I said before, they are granted special abilities that they can use to leap into battle or to immediately cause wounds on others to coagulate or launch bone spikes at things, and because they can't really bleed out and are effectively ageless, they are very difficult to kill and very dangerous. But in order to utilize all of these abilities, they need a steady supply of hemogen, which is produced in the blood of other humanoids, so they need a steady diet of the blood of other humanoids in order to survive. They also need to complete death rest, which requires them to periodically enter a restorative coma state. But unlike the other xenotypes, they have to specifically be created by implanting the genes from one sanguiphage into another. And to that end, if you already have a sanguiphage in your colony, they will gradually regrow the genes that will allow them to do that, and you can just gradually build up a whole colony of sanguiphages. Or you can have some quests pop up that might result in you being able to either force a sanguiphage to implant that gene into one of your colonists, or it might even be offered to you as a reward for completing one of those quests. And if all of that isn't really the thing for you, if you believe the flesh is weak and thus we must rely on the machine, well, they've thought of you as well. They have introduced the Mechanitor, a colonist with an implant that allows them to control machines called mechanoids. These can be everything from very simple laboring bots like constructors or carriers or things like that, all the way up to incredibly powerful combat bots. And in order for your Mechanitor to improve their abilities, eventually they'll have to start taking on the super mechanoid bosses. These are incredibly powerful mechanoids that come with their own escorting armies, and if you're able to summon and defeat them, you can harvest chips from them in order to improve your mechanoid technology. Now, mechanoids have actually been in the game in some form since the base version, where they were a hostile threat that you would run into on occasion. Their capabilities got expanded quite a bit once the Royalty DLC came out because it introduced an entire faction for them, the Mechanoid Hive, and also introduced some in-game events associated with them, as well as mech clusters that would show up occasionally and you would have to defeat because they would cause havoc with your colony. But the Biotech DLC significantly expands them. It introduces a whole bunch of new types of mechanoids, both hostile and friendly, and of course allows you to create your own if you have a Mechanitor. This in turn elevates mechanoids from just being a thing that happened to be in the base game and a credible threat in the Royalty DLC to something much more fully featured with the Biotech DLC. They also introduced a new mechanic for pollution, where if you build up your mechanoid colony with a Mechanitor, then you will gradually produce toxic waste packs, and if those are allowed to deteriorate, they will leak pollutants into your environment, which can gradually mutate the plants and animals, as well as poison your colonists, and even block sunlight and attract enemies. And the way you prevent it from leaking into the environment is that you have to keep the waste packs frozen. So then you're left with a bit of a dilemma, because you have to set up some form of infrastructure to store the waste packs, but then what happens when there's just too many of them and you need to start disposing of them? Well, that's when you need to get a bit creative. You can start dumping them off-site, or you can launch them at your enemies with transport pods, which is kind of hilarious. Or eventually, once you have the high enough tech level for it, and you have the appropriate resources for it, which are very rare and difficult to get, you can build a waste pack atomizer, which, as the name implies, will just destroy the waste packs safely, but it takes a long time to do it and can only process a small number of them at any time. But then again, you can always just embrace the pollution and use gene modding and detoxify your organs and things like that in order to make it so the pollution isn't actually much of a problem for you. And hell, there's an entire xenotype included with the game that is more or less immune to it, which is the Waster. It all gives you some interesting options for developing your colony and various quandaries to deal with, new events to experience, and is generally a pretty significant improvement to the overall Rimworld experience. And when you bring all three of those DLCs together along with the base game, you end up with one hell of a package. The base Rimworld experience is great on its own, don't get me wrong, but with the expansions, it is so much better. But it's not without its faults. I've already mentioned there are a bunch of odd issues and weird omissions in the base game that haven't necessarily been fixed throughout all 3 of the expansions and all the updates that have come out for the game over the years. But while the Biotech DLC finally allowed you to have your colonists make families of their own, you still need the DLC for that to actually work. And that's where things get a bit tricky with my assessment of this game, because I could assess it in a more traditional way where I would just look at the base game and then all 3 of the DLCs individually, give them all individual scores, and then call it a day. But to put it quite simply, that's not how I view Rimworld. Because all 3 of those DLCs also integrate with each other. Each one builds upon the last. You don't just have a situation where you get Rimworld and then the Royalty DLC and the Ideology DLC are all self-contained. No, they interact with each other and they do it very seamlessly. Same thing goes for the Biotech DLC and both of the previous DLCs as well as the base game. It all interacts with each other and all contributes to creating one full package. And so that's what I ultimately view Rimworld as, a full package of the base game and the DLCs all in one. And that's where things get a bit complicated, because there is no package deal that includes Rimworld and all 3 of its expansions. There is a starter pack that is the base game and the Biotech DLC, but it doesn't include Royalty and Ideology. Instead, if you want all 3, then either you need to get the starter pack and then get both of those other DLCs, or you have to buy the base game, and then you have to buy the DLCs for it. And not only is that inconvenient to the buyer, it's also kind of expensive. The base game's MSRP right now is $35 US. The Royalty and Ideology DLCs are $20 each, US again, and the Biotech DLC is currently $25 US. And that package deal containing the base game along with the Biotech DLC is just the cost of both the base game and the DLC, so it's effectively the same price as buying the base game and the Biotech DLC by themselves, just bundled together automatically. Altogether, assuming the game and its DLCs are not on discount, that's $100 US. And obviously, your regional equivalent is going to vary pretty widely there. And the really weird thing is that while it is a lot of money to spend $100 on one game, you have to keep a couple of things in mind. The first is that the price of a standard AAA release these days is $70 US, and its special edition, or deluxe edition, or whatever you want to call it, is going to be $100 US. And those games have far less content, far less replayability. More often than not, they treat their players like complete morons, and they don't have the modding support that Rimworld has. Rimworld has ridiculously good mod support. You can do all kinds of crazy things with the mods in this thing, although they still haven't quite figured out how to do things like Z-levels yet. But apart from Z-levels, most of those things I mentioned that were odd oversights or issues in the base game, whether it be interface problems or the way pawns work or the way that certain omissions are just a bit odd by their absence, well, I can guarantee you there are mods that fix all of those things, except for, again, the Z-level problem. And there are a ridiculous amount of mods that give you all manner of new content. Complete overhauls of systems, systems for vehicles, including flying vehicles. There's even an entire mod that expands dramatically upon the shipbuilding system, and even includes ship combat, both in ship-to-ship engagement and even just boarding enemy ships and taking them over. The possibilities with the modding community are effectively infinite, meaning that not only is this game ridiculously replayable on its own, even without mods, with the mods, replayability is effectively infinite. And you can set up the game to play exactly the way you want it to play using these mods. And with the Steam Workshop support the game has, that makes finding the mods you want and installing them incredibly simple and easy to do. And hell, if you can't find a mod that does exactly what you want to do with the game, well, I'm sure you can probably find a way to mod it into the game yourself. This is of course all not without its faults, however. The more mods you add into the game, the longer it takes to load. even if you're running the game on an SSD, which is exactly what I do, and even that isn't enough to stop the game from taking several minutes to load, even on my Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and RTX 3080 12GB model. And if you happen to be running the game on the Steam Deck, which it does have native support for, then you have to deal with not only the obviously somewhat weaker hardware of the Steam Deck compared to whatever your primary gaming PC is going to be, at least most likely anyway, but you also have to choose whether you want to try running the game on the internal SSD or the SD card, which if you're running it on SD card, it could take a really long time to load, who knows, and then depending on how many mods you have installed and how many you're wanting to try to run on the Steam Deck, you might need to mess around with the Steam Deck config files and increase the size of your Steam Deck swap as well as certain other parameters, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know I had to do to get the thing to run optimally on the Steam Deck with the amount of mods I was running on it. And even then, if you have all of that set up properly, then it can still take quite a long time to load. Now, to be fair, it is only on initial startup that it has to take a long time to load everything in. Once you're actually in the game proper and trying to set up colonies and such, the load times are far less. But that initial loading sequence where it's actually initializing all of the base game files and the expansion files and all of the mods that you have set up and running, well, that can take a while if you happen to have a lot of mods installed. But apart from load times being really long, the only other thing you really need to worry about with regards to throwing a ton of mods into the game is that it can very quickly fill up your architect menu, which is what you use to build all of the various walls and floors and various production facilities and furniture and things like that. And while that can be a bit annoying to deal with on the standard computer interface, and even if you are using interface mods, it can be a bit difficult to deal with, on the Steam Deck in particular, that can get really tricky to mess with because then it doesn't even really fit on your screen. But since that's only really a problem if you're running a whole lot of mods, I'm not really going to count it against the game. It wasn't really designed for that. But that said, you're probably wondering how the game is on Steam Deck. Well, performance-wise, as long as you're not running a whole lot of mods all at once, it runs really well and plays really well, at least until you get those really big colony sizes, in which case, of course, the slowdown gets to be kind of unbearable, but that's a problem with the game on regular PC anyway. And really the only major issue you're going to encounter is the controls, which take a lot of getting used to. They've definitely taken the time and effort to ensure that the default control scheme on the Steam Deck is as intuitive as they can make a game like this on effectively gamepad controls. It does not, however, control like the actual console version does, which controls more like what we would see from console RTSs like Halo Wars, where the cursor is in the middle of the screen, and when you move it around, it moves your whole view. In the Steam Deck version, it still is effectively the PC version, just with gamepad controls. So you have separate controls for moving the viewpoint around, and the cursor operates independent of your viewpoint like on the standard PC version. And you can move the cursor around either with an analog stick or with the right touchpad. And if you want to access functions like you would normally get from right or left clicking on your mouse on the standard computer, you use the left and right triggers. It's definitely an odd control scheme, but once you get used to it, it does actually work reasonably well. It's still nowhere near as good as just playing the game normally on PC with keyboard and mouse, but if you want your Rimworld fix while on the go, then it's a perfectly viable option for you. And since it's on the Steam Deck, it has access to all the same features that the regular PC version does through Steam, so you have the workshop support, the Steam community that you can go to quickly and easily through it, and so on and so forth. So all in all, they did a very good job with their Steam Deck optimizations, and as a result, the entire package of Rimworld just gains some extra value. Not only can you just enjoy the game on PC like you would any other colony sim, any other strategy game, whatever you happen to be playing anyway, and not only can you enjoy all of the mods for it on that PC version, but if you want to take it on the go, you can take it and the mods with you, and it's all quite seamless and easy to work with. Now sure, those of you who have a Steam Deck and are watching this are probably relatively few, but for those of you out there, it is an option. But with that tangent now dealt with, I do need to ultimately bring this whole review to a conclusion. What is my ultimate recommendation for Rimworld? Well, like I said, it is an expensive game if you're going to be getting the base game and all of its DLCs, which is what I recommend. That's $100 US when it's not on sale. And while it does go on sale on a regular basis, the discounts are never that great. It's usually something like 20% off or so you can get a few bucks off, but it's not going to be a massive savings like you would see with a lot of other games. But to those of you who may be concerned about the amount of money that you would be putting into this, I have the following to show you. This, being displayed on screen right now, is the amount of playtime that I have put into Rimworld, both before this review and during this review for getting gameplay footage. And while that number will have increased by the time I have recorded this audio, and thus the image you'll be seeing is of more time than I'm going to tell you right now, I have put over 800 hours into Rimworld. And that wasn't just because I wanted to be really thorough with this review. It's because the game is just that damn good. It is the kind of game where even when you think you have it all figured out and you think you understand exactly what the game is like, it can still throw something into the mix that will surprise you. It is the kind of game that will create some of the most interesting gaming stories you can imagine. Tales of triumph, of tragedy, of depravity, and even just something that is so utterly ridiculous and downright silly you can't help but find it hilarious. And sometimes all of the above wrapped into one. There's a lot of mechanical depth, but it's also easy to understand and includes robust enough tutorials to where you don't really feel like it's all overwhelming. You can learn to pick up and play this game relatively easily, and the difficulty is widely variable from just the actual difficulty settings, ranging from very easy to downright punishingly difficult, to the way the AI storytellers work, where you can have a relatively chill, relaxed experience with Phoebe Chillax, or you can have something utterly ridiculous and crazy like with Randy Random. And if you're like me, then you'll find that it will give you far, far more than $100 worth of entertainment. It has paid for itself 8 times over at this point, and will continue to do so, because I'm certainly not going to stop playing Rimworld after I've finished this review. Much like with Dwarf Fortress and the original Doom, it has become a permanent fixture on my gaming PC. And that is about the highest recommendation that I can give for this thing. But I'm still not going to give it a 5 out of 5. Because 5 out of 5 is reserved for the games that I can recommend to literally anyone. And despite everything I've said up to this point, despite my glowing praise of this game, it's not for everyone. As easy as Rimworld is to get into, you still need to have the patience and the right mindset to be able to play it. So while I can definitely recommend it to pretty much anybody who is even slightly interested in strategy games, I can't necessarily recommend it to literally every gamer out there. Because let's face it, some people just don't have the patience to deal with a strategy game of any kind, regardless of how simple it is, regardless of how easy it is to get into, regardless of how much entertainment value that game has. And as such, I give Rimworld a 4.5 out of 5. And if you're the kind of person who's been on the fence about getting into games like Rimworld, or especially games like Dwarf Fortress, or Songs of Six, or any number of other colony sims out there, Rimworld is the perfect introduction for you, and I will instantly recommend that to anybody who is at least interested in getting into colony sims but isn't really sure yet. Try Rimworld first, and if you end up enjoying it, chances are you'll like those other colony sims too. Thank you all very much for watching. I know this was a long one, and it took quite a while to get out, well past the actual holiday season, to the point where it's pulling double duty as the Holiday 2023 review and the New Year's 2024 review, so it's a bit of an odd situation there, but hey, we're gonna make it work, right? Anyway, thank you all again for watching, and if you like my channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit does help. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you all had a very happy holiday season, and here's hoping this new year will be a great one.